Scariest true story you've heard. Story 1. One of my friend's family growing up had a beach house, and I'd get invited every now and then. They had dollar and the house was massive, a pretty cool place too. They even had a full-time maid who had her own flat at the back. One day they went there for a long weekend, and when they opened the door, the place had been ransacked. It was all a mess, missing TVs, furniture, broken stuff. You get the picture. They went to check on the maid and her flat was empty. All her belongings were gone. They called the cops who came over and had a brief look, not interested from what they said, and left saying the maid probably had something to do with it. And that's what everyone believed for a week. Until the dad returned the following weekend to try and change the locks and etc., and he brought their dogs along with him. Yep, you know it. One of the dogs started digging and found the maid buried in the backyard under a tarp they had close to the pool. So the theory now is that whoever came in probably knew her and she recognized them and she had to go. Edit. I added the gruesome details in a post below. I don't recommend reading them, but it's there for those who are curious. Story 2. My high school GF called late one night after I was home and in bed. She said that something had happened and asked if I could come over. She was clearly shaken and not full of details. So I told my parents and drove over towards her house. At the top of her subdivision, I was met by a cop with lights on. He asked where I was going and I told him about the call from my GF. He lets me go by and I come over the hill to the cul-de-sac where she lives and I see multiple cop cars around the circle. They watch me pull up and get out of my car. My GF comes running out of her house and meets me in the street. She explains that someone had broken into her neighbor's house and started beating her with something heavy. The neighbor managed to get out of the house and headed to my GF's house, where she started banging furiously on the front door. My GF's dad was out of town, so her mom answered the door and the neighbor just fell into the foyer bleeding profusely from the head. Her mom looks up to see the attacker headed up the walkway towards the front door. She pulls the neighbor into the house and closes the door, hitting the attacker with it before it fully closes. He then took the heavy tool he had used to beat the neighbor and smashed the little window at the top of the door. Her mom started screaming and the attacker just turned around and walked up the street into the darkness. I spent the night there that night, along with 2 or 3 cops outside in their cars, and in the morning we could see blood still pooled on the floor in the foyer and splattered blood above the front door from where the attacker had swung the bloody tool to smash the window. No one was ever caught or even identified. It was just completely random. The neighbor survived and, to my knowledge, had no permanent physical injuries beyond scarring from having her scalp stapled shut. She moved away shortly after the incident. Edit. Update on victim's status and paragraphing, though probably not correctly. TLDR. GF's neighbor was brutally attacked in her home. She ran to my GF's house and the attacker fled after nearly getting into their house too. No one was ever caught. Story 3. I work a midnight shift at a gas station, and I have for quite a while at various stations in different areas with varying levels of criminal activity. I have regulars, of course. I'm a small-statured woman, as is my partner the other half of the week, and we've always been partners, so these regulars often worry about us and keep watch on creepy occurrences when they can. I had one man who worked in the metro an hour away who would stop in every morning for his cigarettes. He never smiled or seemed friendly, and as I often do, I tried to think of what I could do that might make him smile one day. It took many months, but I finally pulled it off by having his cigarettes ready on the counter and already scanned for him to pay for as he walked in. He smiled and then asked me, "Do you ever get scared on the night shift? You small girl is not safe." I said I sometimes did, but we could lock the doors and hide if we had to, and that the provincial police, think state troopers, if you're American, had a station close by and came in often to get their highway vehicles washed. I had a good rapport with those police. He nodded and then told me a story about when he first moved to our country from Eastern Europe with his wife and child back in the late 80s, early 90s. He fell asleep at work one night at the gas station he worked at. When he woke up, the phone had been ringing for hours and his manager was shaking him, violently asking if he was all right. He was fine, he said. What was the problem? He was sorry he fell asleep. His manager screamed that it was fine he fell asleep, to look outside. All of their motor oil was missing and the outside of the place was a mess. The thieves had come and swiped all the oil and left him because he slept through the entire thing and then moved down the road to the next station for an encore. At that station, the clerk was awake and fought back, so the thieves stabbed him to death and left him to bleed out. When he finished telling me this, he concluded with, "If you ever feel sleepy, just lock the door and do it. It might save your life." I don't work at that station anymore, but I think about that guy all the time and wonder how his grandkids are. Story 4. When I was learning to drive, my instructor advised me to always lock my car doors as soon as I get into my car. I asked her why, and she told me her personal experience. This happened almost a year after she passed her test. She finished work about 3 a.m. She just got into her car and got her keys in the ignition when 3 guys jumped into her car. She had a knife to her neck and was told to drive. They give her directions to an alleyway. They dragged her out of the car and raped her. After they were done with her, they left her in the alleyway and stole her car and purse. It took her a while to get help. Police did find her car a few days later, abandoned and on fire, on the outskirts of the city. But the guys were not caught. The reason she started to teach driving was her way to protect other women and make sure no one else goes through what she went through. So she advised all her female students to lock their car doors as soon as they get in. Edit to add. Wow, I wasn't expecting this comment to go this big. I'm still in contact with my instructor via social media. I sent her screenshots of this comment and the other comments. She is happy that her advice/warning is out there before she retires for health reasons. She wants me to clear a misunderstanding that she saw in the comments. She does give the same advice to her male students, and she does tell them her experience, but leave out the rape part. She does get messages from her past students, including me, saying, "Thank you for the advice/warning," and we tell her about our close calls. A message from her, "Thank you for sharing your experience and advice so that others can be safe and they don't go through the same experience." Story 5. I was around 10 years old. I was at school, but my mom told me she was thinking of taking me to the doctor's in the afternoon, recurring eye issue. Lunchtime, and I'm in the dining hall when the office woman told me there was a taxi outside for me and I needed to go. I assumed my mom booked it for me as she can't drive. I cleared up my stuff and got my bag. Just about to leave when I remembered my jacket in my classroom. I rush to get and head out for the taxi. Office woman tells me I'm too late and the taxi has gone without me. I just went back to class, but panicking my mom would be angry at me. School finishes and my mom is waiting for me at the gates. I burst into tears apologizing for missing the taxi and thinking I was in big trouble. She never ordered a taxi and had no clue what I was talking about. She ended up not making the doctor appointment. No one ever found out who ordered the taxi or who the driver was. My mom doesn't like to think what would have happened if I hadn't forgotten my jacket and got in that taxi. TLDR missed a taxi I thought my mom booked for me, only to find out it could have been an attempted kidnapping. Story 6. Well, it's my story. When I was a little kid, 5 to 6, we had this neighbor like grandma to me. I'd go over and have snacks, and she had a Mr. Potato Head. I played with that was her, now adult, son's toy. Weird core memories. He came home, in his 20s, from the army, I think. I don't remember much about him, but he asked about taking my older brothers camping, but my mom said no. She had a weird feeling about him. Side note, we lived out in the country, not even a town, just a place. There were no locked doors. Everyone trusted each other. My mom saw him at our little store with bee stings all over and was concerned. He said he got them at the creek. She thought that was weird, because that's just not a thing where we went all the time, but okay. A little while later, not sure how long, the news said there was a murder of some campers out past where we lived. No leads. People were shocked. This doesn't happen here. My mom remembered her weird feeling and the bee stings that didn't make sense. She called the police to say, "Hey, probably nothing, but here's what I got." I remember detectives coming to our house to talk to her. They had some other evidence that matched, but not enough to link him to the murder, a couple with their child. It's unsolved to this day, though the detective said he knew it was him. A few years later, the guy went to prison for an abduction/attempted murder of a woman who ran out of gas, and he offered her a ride. She lived. Thank God. Story 7. My grandfather's village was razed by the Nazis. He had 9 siblings. The Nazis came to the village in retribution due to guerrilla attacks, and they believed the guerrillas were hiding there. Most young men fled before they arrived. The men that were in the village were lined up against a wall and shot. My grandfather's mother put half her children, the youngest, in the cellar, and she took the other half with her because the Nazis were rounding up the entire village and locked them inside the church. The reason she had split her children was because she feared they would all be killed, so she wanted at least some of them to survive. The Nazis ransacked and burned nearly every house in the village, including my grandfather's. He was in the cellar with his siblings and their house burned above them, but they were saved. Those in the church also survived, but many didn't. After this, the Nazis would come again, sometime after, and pretty much force all the young men and boys, including my grandfather, to help make roads and fortifications for them. Despite it, they all survived the war, though many in the family didn't. Story 8. My college girlfriend called me one night. The Baton Rouge serial killer had been active a while, and she was being followed all over town and even after going in circles by a whole truck, which the killer supposedly drove. She fit the victim profile. She was brunette living in a house sitting for her aunt, a wealthy neighborhood. My roommate and I drove over and we filed in line behind her and the truck. She lived essentially on the LSU grounds, so I assumed it was a stupid student prank or something. She parks at her aunt's house. Truck stops one house short of her aunt's and we pull in behind her. I explain I'm going to defuse the situation. Walk over to the truck. The FBI says the killer is a white guy. This man is African American. Explain no one is upset, but he's freaking out my girlfriend. He needs to leave. He looks side-eyed at me and drives off. I see the guy again a few months later. On the cover of the Baton Rouge paper, he's been arrested. He was the killer. Story 9. In the 1990s, a nurse in New Jersey killed hundreds of hospital patients. Sometimes he would sneak into patients' rooms at night and inject them with fatal medication doses. Other times, he would put the medication into 4 bags in the supply room, so they would kill whatever random patient they were given to later. He was accused several times. Some patients pointed him out before they died. Some staff thought he was creepy and dangerous and refused to work with him. He kept getting fired from hospitals, but the hospital managers knew that if he got arrested, they would be sued by the families of the patients he murdered. so they just fired him and didn't call the police. That happened at 12 different hospitals over the course of 16 years. Investigators believe he killed as many as 400 people. After he was arrested, he confessed to 40 murders. In 29 of them, he gave enough detail to be charged and plead guilty. He is linked to 300 plus more deaths than that, but details of those will probably never be known because so much information was lost over time or destroyed by the hospitals. Story 10. This only happened earlier this year. A work colleague was off work for a long time, not like him at all. When he eventually returned, we found out that his friend had been murdered by a group of football wankers. They'd been in a pub watching a match for the team they supported. They were celebrating a win when a group of men from the opposing team got angry and started arguing. When my colleague and his friends left the pub, they jumped his friend and beat him so badly he ended up in hospital where he eventually succumbed to the injuries. This is one of the reasons I hate football, especially where I am, England. Riot vans, hundreds of police, etc., are always around every train station and football stadium. Sad little men willing to take a life over a bag of air getting kicked around. It's not the first time, certainly won't be the last. Someone has died over fucking football. Story 11. Up to this day, I'm still looking for a logical explanation to this. This happened in 2003. So I and an ex were checked in a coastal resort where the cottages were far apart, like 200 m away. Around 11 to 11:30 p.m., while we're both drinking beer with the lights turned off and only the TV on, the doorknob suddenly rattled violently, like someone was forcibly trying to get it open. There was no double lock on the door, so my first reaction was to jump from the bed and block the door with my weight. The force of my landing must have been heard from the other side, but the twisting of the doorknob continued. By this time, I was already pressing my face to the floor, trying to estimate how many people were outside the door via the small gap between the floor and the bottom of the door. There was nothing, not one pair of feet or anything, but the doorknob just kept rattling. I should point out that the gap between the floor and the door was enough for me to see the outside, or at the very least notice any change in shadow/light caused by movement, but there was nothing. The turning of the door knob then stopped, but I never heard any footsteps or any other noise. Waited a few minutes and opened the door. Everything was quiet, no footprints outside or on the sand surrounding the cottage. We just noped out of there immediately. Story 12. When I was 17, I was hanging out with two friends and they wanted to go smoke weed in the woods. I didn't feel like it, so I drove them and waited in the car. After a while, I was getting bored and decided to go meet them, but there were 4 paths going off in different directions, so I just took the biggest one. After walking for a few minutes in the pitch-black forest, before flashlights on phones, I come across this dip in the trail, and on the other side is a bench lightly visible due to the moonlight. On the bench is sitting a man and another one is standing in front of him, but I can only make out silhouettes. Being sure these are my friends, I yell out to them before walking over. If you ever walked the woods at night, it's just an uneasy feeling all around, so I was cautious to begin with. Well, it turns out, just after yelling out to my friends, both silhouettes turn around towards me. Not a word, not a sound. The guy sitting down starts sprinting full fucking speed towards me in complete silence. I got the absolute fuck out of their sprinting, also the other way and tripping over shit because I couldn't see anything. I finally got out and locked myself in my car, but I was really worried for my friends. Maybe a minute later, I see them both coming out of a completely different path. They also confirmed they never saw me or anyone else. My heart still sinks just thinking about that dude sprinting in silence. WTF was that shit. Story 13. the legend of Bearman. So people think of that one South Park episode with Bearman Pig. No, it's not even close to that. So there was this camp I used to go to during the summer. There were probably around 500 kids there for a week straight. Everyone had cabins they would stay in assigned by gender and age and had an older person be in charge of one cabin. The older person was around 17 to 18 watching 13 to 16-year-olds in the cabins. And then the staff were actual adults who had their own cabins, but they would be on night shift duties to walk around and make sure everyone was staying in their cabins. So now that you kinda know the setting, let's get into the legend. As it goes, in the woods, and when all the kids were in the cabins and the lights were out, a bear would come out from the deep woods and wander into the campgrounds. The bear would then stand on its back legs and walk as if it was a human. Then it would choose to go into a cabin, and if you were unlucky, it would go by your bed and watch you sleep. If you made any single move, it would grab you and take you into the woods, never to be seen again. Hearing that scared the crap out of 14-year-old me. It was something the older girl told all of us. A bunch of the other girls were like, "It's so we stay quiet and sleep," but other kids from cabins heard of it too. I never stopped thinking about it, and I would always try to stay as still as possible when I slept. Flash forward a few years later, I ran into one of the staff that used to work at the camp, and I told them about how scared I was about Bearman, but it was a good trick to use to get kids to stay quiet. Well, turns out, it's actually based on a true story. I guess back in the 80s, a man dressed in a bear costume, which was some sort of mascot for the camp at the time, and took the girls out of their cabin. Sue, as you could imagine, to my horror, I was completely bewildered that a Bearman actually existed at some point in time. Story 14. A robbery at my place, but the way in which it happened. I lived in a basement suite with my younger brother in a quiet neighborhood. The entire front of the house is exposed to the sidewalk, but the sides and the back are covered with fences and trees. The only way to see if anyone is in the basement is through this small window in my bedroom that's about 5 feet from my bed. I got word while I was out that my place had been robbed. The robbers went through the basement suite door through the back, kicked it open, then made themselves upstairs after robbing the basement suite. They just so happened to rob the place in a 30-minute window when myself, my brother, and the people upstairs were out. This means they were watching us for a couple days and monitoring our patterns. What scared me was not really the robbery, but the image of me sleeping while a robber pressed his face against the window 5 feet away from my bed, just watching me. Story 15. I'm the firstborn, and when I was just a wee babe, my mother put me to bed and headed off to bed herself. Being new parents, they were all about the baby monitor. Dad was already asleep, and just as my mom was drifting off, she heard the telltale crackle. "Don't worry, sweetheart, Mommy's here." Needless to say, my mom about shit herself and catapulted to the nursery to find me fast asleep and totally alone. Turns out the neighbor had just had a baby too, and they were picking up each other's signals. They actually picked up all kinds of things over time. Used to hear the truckers radioing to each other from the highway, like a mile away. Story 16. The other night, my wife took our child out for several hours. At that time, I wrapped up work, then left to get dinner around 4:30 p.m. Got home around 6:30, played with our dog, and did a few chores. Then, when my wife got home about 7:30, we relaxed a bit and I headed for bed about 9 p.m., usually up early with our kid. Maybe 2 minutes after crawling into bed, I get a text from my wife with a picture of our dry erase menu board on our fridge. See, usually at the start of the week, my wife will fill out a rough menu for dinners that week. I remembered seeing it earlier in the day and it was filled out as expected. The picture she sent was of the menu all scrambled up, like the letters were all moved everywhere, with random words and squiggles throughout. Some of it was her writing, but others were incomplete words, or rewritten words in handwriting that weren't hers or mine. This freaked us out, as our 1-year-old certainly didn't do it. The county sheriff showed up and swept the house and found nothing. Nothing was out of place or missing either. He was spooked by it a bit too. He said they never get a call out in the country where we are and recommended we change our locks. We hadn't, as the couple we bought our home from were elderly. So, we did that night. Edit. See the 2 photos. This is an example of her writing. The other is the actual scrambled menu with her question she wrote on the bottom and texted to me. Story 17. My brother was dating the love of his life up until a few years ago. They met because they both worked in a restaurant. He was a piano player, she was a waitress. Things were going amazingly between them. The only problem was, she had a jealous ex. He knew when they left work and what shifts they'd work since it was the same each week. He decided for whatever reason he was going to teach my brother a lesson for dating his ex and planned to attack him with a Stanley knife when he left work one evening. That night, my brother and his partner were getting ready to leave, and he stopped for a second to talk to a colleague, meaning she left first. As soon as she stepped out the door, he slashed her throat and then ran. She died in front of him. That attack was meant for my brother. He's gone through a lot of therapy and down some very dark paths since then, but is finally coming out of the other side of it. But it's terrifying how close I came to losing my little brother and how much he lost as a consequence because of some fucking deranged nutjob. If I could get my hands on that guy, I'd get locked up myself. But he's in prison for a long time, and so far he's staying there. Story 18. When I was about 18, my friend and I went to the movies and then decided to walk home. It was a bit of a walk, but we didn't want to pay for a cab. I'm always pretty vigilant when walking, especially at night, so I noticed a guy with his hood up walking behind us. Every so often I'd look over my shoulder to check on him. He started pretty far behind us, but was gaining ground weirdly quickly. The last time I turned my head, I caught him sprinting at us. I panic and tell my friend to run for it. She's in those fucking Birkenstock slip-on sandals that were popular then, and she's struggling to run, so I'm dragging her until we get to a gas station. I bang on the window and beg the clerk to let us in, but he says he can't because it's past a certain time at night, but he promises if the guy comes near us, he'll call the cops. The guy comes down the hill, through the gas station, staring at us the entire time. I swear the only reason he thought better of it was because the gas clerk had the phone visibly in his hand, plus he was a big guy. I completely broke down after he left. Just the thought that he was running at us while I had my back turned scares the shit out of me. What if I hadn't turned when I did that last time? Story 19. One of my many experiences with night terrors / sleep paralysis left me with memory loss, and now I have to live with the fact that my body kinda operated without me for a week. I was about 7 years old and woke in the middle of the night to find this smoke creature crawling up the bottom of my bed. It was terrifying, as you can imagine, and I booked it for the landing, which is weird for me because looking back I would have expected it to be sleep paralysis. I still get these occurrences often, but I could move perfectly well on this occasion. I reached the top of the stairs outside my bedroom and another one was slowly making its way up, step by step out of the darkness of the floor below. I froze and looked around for somewhere else to run to, but I was pinned because the first one was making its way through my bedroom doorway toward me. Both of these smoke demon things were advancing on little 7-year-old me, so I did the only thing I could think of, screamed the house down. Mom comes running just as I start to go blind with smoke creeping into my vision. Blood pressure was working out. It was the same smoke, I get when I stand up fast. Mom ends up soothing me, taking me back to bed, and at some point she leaves and lets me go back to sleep. Next morning, I apologize for waking her up last night. She has no idea what I mean and we're both confused. I tell her, I woke you up on the stairs. I was having a nightmare. She informs me that happened over a week ago, not last night. I have no memory of that week occurring, not a single shred, but apparently I had gone to school every day, played with my friends, eaten my dinner, done my homework, had my baths, all without knowing that I had done it. Apparently, I'd been kinda quiet during that week, and my mom assumed I was having trouble at school, which was not an uncommon experience for me. But I still, to this day, don't remember anything after that night, and it gives me the creeps to imagine that my body has done things, gone through the motions of everyday life, without me having any knowledge of doing it. Story 20. Something weird happened to me, more scary in a what could have been kind of way, so not on the same scale as the poor people in the comments. I was 17 years old, male, and walking home from a night out quite drunk and stoned about 2 a.m. I'm in a lonely part of my walk with no people, few cars, just a road and some large shops, a band queue and a carpet showroom, out-of-town shopping complexes that have since become ubiquitous in the UK. Anyway, in a lay-by about 15 feet away is a silver car pulled up with lights on. As I stumble past, two men step out and call me over. Something about the situation immediately sobers me up. I keep walking and one of them shouts, "It's fine, we are the police. We will drive you home." I stop for a moment and reply with some smart arse comment along the lines of how the police would never do this and that they were dodgy. Calling them dodgy always sticks in my mind. He insists I'm too drunk and it's not safe for a young man like me, and I should let them take me home. I say no, and he then tells me to come over here and listen to the police radio in the car to prove they are real police. It's weird the guy is almost begging me, desperation in his voice. I repeat a firm no, tell them I'm fine and keep walking. Minute I'm out of sight, I run as fast as I can and don't relax until 30 minutes later I'm home. I can only assume they didn't manhandle me into the car because there was the very occasional taxi driving past. I'm 45 now and occasionally think about how that could have ended for me. None of the scenarios seem good. Sadly, stories like this are probably more routine for women, but at the time it really shook me up. Story 21. This story kind of creeps me out even to this day, but I have a pretty good one. I lived in Mesa, Arizona when I was 10 years old. We lived in a rough area, but I was just a kid completely ignorant to the dangers of the world. I was walking back home from my friend's house, and my mother wanted me home by 9, and I'd always start walking back at around 8:40 to make sure I wasn't late, and it's only like a couple blocks from my house, so it wasn't a super long distance. It was around the time of year when the sun would set at 5:30 and be dark well before 7 p.m. So it was very much nighttime. As I'm walking, I heard a woman calling my name. I turned to look and saw it was one of my mom's friends, but she didn't know her too well. However, I just saw that she was familiar and won't say a name, but I turned around and said hello and smiled. She walked up to me and told me my mom had called her and asked her to come get me and ride me back because something happened at my house. She said it was an emergency and that I needed to go with her and her husband, whom my family was also familiar with. I was only about 5 minutes from my house, but I was told it was an emergency and I agreed to go with her. As I'm walking, I get this weird feeling in my gut and this shaking in my legs that I now realize was my instincts being on high alert. I stopped for a minute and asked if we could call my mom, and she said my mother was in the hospital right now and that I needed to hurry. Right as we were opening the door to the car, I heard my mother shout my name as loud as she could, and I turned on a dime and quickly walked towards my mom. My mom asks what's going on, and the woman replies and says that she was just giving me a ride home because she saw me. Was not the story she gave me, so I told my mother what she told me and asked what was going on. My mom just looked at me, and she could always tell when I'm lying versus when I'm telling the truth. The woman then goes to interrupt me, likely to lie, and my mom cuts her off and just stares back at her with the most shocked look ever, and these words still send shivers down my spine. She says in the most shocked voice ever, "You are trying to take my son." And the husband looks out the window, hurrying his wife in the car, and as I look back at him, I can see a syringe on the dashboard leaning against the windshield that he grabs right as I see it. She got in the car because at that point my mom was ready to kill her and reached into her purse because she keeps a pocket knife. But they drove away, and right after they did, my mom looked at me and just burst into tears saying, "I'm almost lost you." My mom knew full well what was happening, and I was still too shaken to even say anything and just hugged her back and we went home. I was still in denial, and to cope, I would convince myself that maybe I wasn't in any danger. My family never kept in contact with any of them, but my stepdad at the time submitted a tip to the police of the incident. When they caught up with him about 3 months later, we found out that he was arrested for having CP on his computer and found restraints in his closet, as well as some containers of propofol. They found pictures of me from my mom's Facebook downloaded on his computer as well, leading them to believe that I was actually being watched for a good bit. I never liked talking about it because to this day, if I hadn't stopped for those 10 seconds to ask the woman to call my mom, I don't know where I'd be or if I'd even be alive right now making this comment. And while it may seem like something that would have easily been forgotten, it was never the case for me. I haven't even told my closest friends this story, but I might sometime soon. I asked my mom what happened that night, why she came looking for me. She described the same feeling I remembered feeling moments before I was almost abducted, just a lot sooner than I did, and just had the instinct that I was in danger. I'm not usually a lucky person. It seems the odds are always against me, but I always remember how lucky I was that night, that my mom decided to listen to her instincts when I didn't. I've never ignored my instincts since, and every night after that, when I finally did decide to leave my house, my mom would walk with me all the way up until I turned 13 to come back to live with my dad. And that to date is the scariest thing I think I've ever experienced. It's some shit you only hear of on the news and nobody ever assumed it would happen to them, but my life was a mere 20 seconds from being completely different. Story 22. Back in 2019, I was in a place in Thailand for people who got caught on drug using. It's like a prison for children. One day, the new prisoner transfer, and he was a young 17-year-old boy with good skills in sport. He is the best player of country badminton club. The second day he arrive, he come to me and say, "Hey, you wanna escape this place with me?" I refuse. Next day, we all are called to gather in the center hall, and his dead body is lying there and cops everywhere. There the story is, after I refuse to go with him, he does the escape thing itself at night. He climbs through the wall, then starts to swim across the river, but at last he couldn't make it. The police said he drowned like 12 hours before someone saw his body. After the thing happened, I was in shock for 2 weeks. My mother had to take me to another hospital. Rest in peace, my friend. Sorry, my English is very bad. Story 23. My grandpa and his hunting buddy were out moose hunting years ago, when my mom was still a kid. They were about an hour into a hike, looking for a big bull, when they decided to split up to cover more ground. My grandpa, after about 15 to 20 of walking through dense brush, came into a small clearing of trees, and a mama grizzly and her 2 cubs. Almost instinctively, my grandpa scrambles up the closest tree, just out of the angry mama bear's reach, even kicking at her snout a few times. After circling and scratching at the tree he's in, Mama Bear ambles off into the brush, her cubs right behind her. When he thinks he's in the clear, he starts climbing down, but a crash from the same bushes Mama Bear walked into makes him go straight back up the tree. She must have seen him trying to climb down because she charged right back at him, now furiously snapping at his feet and shaking the tree. Again, after circling the tree and growling up a storm, she leaves a second time, and again, my grandpa waits, but a little longer. He manages to carefully make his way down and sort of speed walks in the direction where he and his buddy parked their truck. Mama Bear had definitely been watching, because as soon as he was almost out of the clearing, she came charging out once more. He quickly shot up another tree, this time a little higher up than his previous safe spot. After a good long while of her snarling, shaking and scratching the tree and overall terrorizing my grandpa, she left, this time a little faster. My grandpa was in that tree for what seemed like forever, listening carefully for any movement, but after about half an hour, he slowly made his way down the tree, pausing every so often to make sure Mama Bear wasn't just peeking over the brush, waiting for him. After making it to the ground and checking to see if the coast was clear, my grandpa made a quick but quiet getaway back to the truck, where his hunting buddy was waiting, equally empty-handed. When questioned why he didn't bring anything back, my grandpa explained he just had a run-in with the world's most persistent mother bear. That was enough explanation. Story 24. A man disappeared in front of me. I was at a summer camp and my group was returning to our dorms later in the night. 5 or so people. As we were stumbling up, a man in dark clothes was walking towards our dorm and we called out to him. Never got a good look at his face. But there weren't many adults at the camp, and this guy was. Starts off into a dead sprint and disappears into a large shrub of bushes. Me and my buddy had ran after him thinking he was a fellow camper. Rushed into the bushes about 5 seconds later at most, and nothing. He disappeared. The closest building was not accessible from the back, where he went towards, and a smaller bathroom. The area behind it was woodland, and it was completely illuminated. You make a lot of noise running through woods as well. He completely vanished. No way we wouldn't have spotted him in some fashion. Everyone was weirded out. Still can't explain it at all. Story 25. The events surrounding the father and son who built submarines and explored the bottom of Lake Tahoe. It's pretty widely known that it's one of the deepest lakes of the world, and at the bottom, a combination of almost freezing cold water and low oxygen keep things preserved for a very long time. There are underwater tunnels that reach between Lake Tahoe and other smaller lakes, and things will get trapped in pockets of the tunnels and whatnot. There are reports and pictures of fully preserved Native American Indians and gangsters in pinstripe suits, and enormous grizzly bears. It gets creepy because there is another lake in the area which has 2 names. One name is the official name, which I'm not sure of, and the other is Dead Baby Lake. This is because the local Indians would bury young dead babies in the lake, hoping their spirits would live on. Anyways, when the father and son reached the bottom of the lake in their submersible, they recorded footage of what they saw. Upon resurfacing, though, they were both very, very visibly disturbed and wouldn't talk or show evidence of what they saw. They locked the video away and proclaimed that the world isn't ready to see the things they had captured. Story 26. There's an abandoned house in my town. Some dude inherited it after his aunt died. He's just leaving it to crumble. But that's not the scary part. So this lady took in every stray cat she found, and she was good to them. They were always fed and healthy and brought to the vet often. She was nice, to anyone who was nice to her cats anyways. She'd sit outside in spring and summer and nice autumn days. So when winter rolls around and she's nowhere to be seen, people think nothing of it. Then spring comes. People realize she's not out, and after a week, concerns arise. A wellness check is found and the cops get into the house. They say the place stank of cat piss and crap, and there was a lingering smell of decay. They walk around noting trash not taken out and stinking, cat carriers with tags on in a spare room. And then her room. They open the door and find her on her floor being eaten by the cats. She was long dead and decaying by then. Story 27. My girl and I were flying into her hometown after being out pursuing around the country for Thanksgiving. It was a few days earlier than scheduled, so we didn't tell any of her family, or mine, who also flew in, because we had been spending Thanksgiving together for the last few years. We honestly didn't utter a word. This was back in 1992, so there were no cell phones and no tracking abilities or any of that BS. Anyway, we got into town late at night. 11 p.m. or 12 a.m. We had decided that we were going to stay in a hotel since the plan was to surprise the family, and while showing up on their doorstep late at night would have certainly surprised them, that wasn't really the kind we were going for. We get into our room. It's got a kitchenette, a couch, a TV, a king bed. It's all around probably one of the nicer places we've stayed in. I passed out immediately. She takes a shower. From what she's told me, she lays in bed, unable to sleep until about 2 a.m. For context, we were in an extended stay hotel with a door that led right out into the parking lot. There was a sliding glass door to the left of the bed. Straight ahead was the couch, the door, a desk, and a smaller window. Blinds were shut on the sliding glass door, but on the smaller window, I guess they opened a crack, but when she realized she was so tired, she didn't care all that much. Our room was completely dark, so it wasn't really like anybody could see in any way. As she turns over to go to sleep at 2 a.m., through the slightly open blinds at the smaller window, she sees a flash, like a camera flash, but because the parking lot is 50 steps away, she just simply assumes that it's a street light and doesn't think anything of it and falls asleep. 5 a.m. rolls around and I'm woken up to loud knocking on the sliding glass door. She wakes up only a few seconds after I do and is just as confused and disoriented as I am. Continuous, persistent knocking. I had half a mind to just assume that it was some drunkard. It was the holidays after all, who had come back from a night out and made a wrong turn somewhere while trying to get back to his room, but was sure he was where he was supposed to be. Knocking stops briefly, then starts on the front door. I want to further emphasize how this knocking was. Not quite a police knock, but someone was sure that they wanted into this room and wasn't going to stop until they got in. I go over to the door to look through the peephole and I don't see anybody. The knocking starts again on the sliding glass door. If it was someone trying to wake up whoever they were with because they got locked out of their room, wouldn't they be announcing themselves? Wouldn't they be calling out the name of the person that they were trying so desperately to wake up? Like I said, the knock wasn't quite police-like, so I know that it wasn't them. They would have made sure everyone knew they were there had it been. I go back to the sliding glass door and stand there. The knocking persists. Once it stops, I peel the curtain back just enough that I can see out of the window. I'm pretty blind without contacts and don't have my glasses on, so I am practically pressing my face up to the glass to see who I can see, and I see nobody. The second that I shut the blinds, the knocking starts again. At this point, I'm freaked out. I was trying to keep my composure so as to not make my girl unsettled, but we're both already past that point. Nobody knows that we're here. Nobody that would want to pull a prank on us. None of our family, our friends, nobody. The only person that knows we're here was the older man who checked us in, and why the hell would he care where we are? I'm borderline a little worried for our safety. If whoever was out there managed to get in and had cruel intentions upon entering, I'm a small guy. I'm 5 feet 8 inches and 125 pounds soaking wet. I can talk a lot of crap and can throw a punch, but if somebody bigger than I really wants to kick my ass, they'll be able to do it no problem. I call up to the front desk as the knocking doesn't stop, and on the second ring, the man who checked us in answers and seems concerned as to why I'm calling at this hour. I explain the situation. The knocking is still happening as I'm on the phone, and he tells me that he's going to send the security guard over to check it out. The knocking continues on for about another minute. Not even probably 2 or 3 minutes after the knocking stops, I get a call back from the front desk who says that security didn't see any signs of anybody, but that he apologizes for whatever happened. Super comforting. Neither one of us fell back asleep until it was light out, and when we went out later in the day, there was a singular footprint leading away from the sliding glass door. Weird because we were in a nice part of town. It was a place she grew up in and therefore felt safe in, knowing the area as well as she did. That's one of the reasons we chose to stay at this place. It was horrible. We are both still stumped as to what the situation was. I don't know. I still get uncomfortable just thinking about it, really. Story 28. I have twice in my life encountered something I cannot identify that has been identified to me as a Wendigo. I went out backcountry camping. Not terribly far out, but far enough off the beaten track that I know there were no people within 5 kilometers. For the record, no drugs or alcohol, not overly tired, and if I had only been once in my life, I would write it off as a dream or misremembered memory. Got a little thirsty late at night, cleared out my water bottle, figured I would walk down to the river nearby, fill my bottle so the chlorine tablets could do their job overnight, and I'd have water in the morning, maybe a 5-minute hike from my camp. There, by the water, lit only by the moon, is an animal. My flashlight is pointed at my feet so I don't trip. It's got 4 legs and appears dark/black. I'm going through the list in my head. Too thin for a black bear. Can't think of anything else that'd be that dark. And then it stood up. I can only describe it as a muscular coyote with no fur, black skin, long arms, and judging by the trees it was standing near, about 7 feet tall. It looked at me. I looked at it. That was not a coyote. It was not a bear. I don't know what it was, but I sure as hell wasn't gonna find out in the middle of the night. I kept facing it, backed away slowly until I was out of line of sight, got back to my camp, packed up my shit, and left. Some years later, and about 1,000 kilometers away, I had a second encounter. Late at night, I'm walking down a dirt service road near a farm. Head pops up out of the wheat and looks at me. I recognize that shape. It wasn't looking at me. I shouted, "Hey, don't mind me, I'm just going that way." It looked at me. The head disappeared into the wheat. Noped the fuck out of there. I don't know what I saw. It doesn't match anything I've ever seen. I've since had the chance to speak to some people about it. Answer I get is a wolf or coyote with mange. No way. Ears were wrong, and those arms were too long, aside from the way it stood. I don't claim it was supernatural or some undiscovered cryptid, but I don't go walking in the moonlight in the backcountry of the Rockies anymore. Story 29. A couple friends of mine had a horrific honeymoon experience. They took their honeymoon at a resort in Mexico. It wasn't super high-end, but was nice enough for them, as they weren't super well-off and paid for it themselves. Their first night, they go down to a resort bar on the beach. The husband had a couple of drinks, and the wife was sipping on her first. It wasn't long before she began acting very intoxicated, and he, not being a stranger to drinking, was beginning to feel way more drunk than the amount he had drunk. They both began to feel uneasy, so they decided to head up to their room early. He is woken up hours later by his wife, who is hysterical. They are both completely naked and on the floor. No memory of how either of them ended up that way or even making it back to their room. Their room had been ransacked and all of their cash and credit cards were gone. They both feel like they have the worst hangovers in the world, and now they have no money and are in another country. They frantically begin calling family and friends, but are having trouble getting a hold of anyone because it's so early in the morning. Finally managed to get a hold of some mutual friends of ours and explain what happened. They managed to get some money sent to them, but had some hurdles because of their lack of cards. Thankfully, they both made it back. Still no memory of what happened after they left the bar. Shook them both up really good, and they don't like to talk about it. Story 30. My father was a Vietnam veteran, and he never really talked about the war to us. You could tell it was painful for him. As he got older, he became really sick, and the VA doctors said that it was all due to him being exposed to Agent Orange while in Vietnam. He passed away almost 8 years ago at age 68. He was getting full compensation from the VA for his disability, and one way for him to get the money was to see a psychiatrist. I took him to his apartment and he asked me to go in with him for support. The psychiatrist asked him to talk about his time in Vietnam, and one story he told that broke him down into tears was about a friend of his. So soldiers were told that if they were sleeping and they heard sirens that bombs were about to be dropped, that they needed to try and cover themselves with whatever they had that may be substantial. My father and his friend were sleeping and the sirens went off. My dad woke and threw whatever he had on top of him, and luckily that saved his life. When the bombing had stopped, my dad came out from underneath and saw that his friend never took cover due to him sleeping through the sirens, and he was decapitated. I will never forget that story. Story 31. About 5 years ago, we stayed at a very nice resort in Mexico. We'd been there several times before without any issues. This time, we were on the beach at the resort. I was in a hammock in my white bikini. My husband had wandered off somewhere nearby. A well-dressed, kind of older guy came over from the bar. He started asking me how I was enjoying my trip, was I staying at the resort, who were we traveling with, etc., etc. But very conversational, like, so I don't even realize at the time that he was gathering information. My husband came over to where we were chatting, and the guy eventually went back to the bar. I don't drink, so my husband was double fisting it at the bar. He's a big guy and an experienced drinker, but 2 hours and 4 drinks later, he is practically babbling on the ground. I had to practically drag him up to our room. We get in the room, and he immediately takes off all his clothes and gets on top of the bed and passes out. I laid down next to him to make sure he was still breathing and didn't puke or anything. Well, about 30 minutes into this, there is a knock on our hotel room door. Since my husband is naked and inebriated, I decided not to answer. That's when I hear something like a room key and 3 men come into our room. I am completely and utterly befuddled. I had no idea what was going on. So I sit up and ask them, "Is everything okay?" They stood and stared at me for several long seconds as I stared back at them. I was shocked they didn't leave, because my naked husband was on the bed. Finally, one looks at me and says, "Albanumis?" And I said, "No, senor, bathroom is fine." Then they backed out of the room. I guess the plan was, I was supposed to be passed out drunk too. By double fisting it, my husband got a double dose of whatever. He woke up several hours later and remembered none of it. Story 32. My boyfriend went camping with friends once, before we met. His friends went to bed one by one, and he was the last one at the fire, waiting for it to die down while he finished a beer. Said he got the distinct feeling someone was watching him, and he's an avid camper, so he said it really struck him as odd that he was feeling nervous. Anyway, it was enough to make him put out the fire and go sleep in his car with the doors locked. So he falls asleep and in the middle of the night hears a big noise that wakes him up. He wasn't sure what it was because he had been sleeping and didn't hear anything else. Maybe he dreamt it, but it's still pitch black out, so he stays in the car and goes back to sleep. The next morning, he wakes up and the first thing he sees is a big handprint on his passenger side window, like someone had smacked the glass. His friends swear it wasn't them, and I believe them. They're not the type to prank each other like that. Still freaks me out, and I think about it sometimes when I camp now. Story 33. Was out in California with my wife and daughter. She was about 10 months old at the time, visiting my father-in-law. We drove into the city to hang out. He had to handle a traffic ticket, so we drove to the courthouse. As we drive in, this car is driving into the lot. There was a gate with a guard, not driving super fast, but too fast for a parking lot. The attendant seemed to be running after the car. We were super confused. Car proceeds to drive into the lot, picks up even more speed. Then the passenger, a woman, opens the door and falls out of the car. We stop our car. We're not in the lot yet and are all wondering WTF is going on. The car stops. The driver hops out and starts chasing the woman. Then all hell breaks loose. She's screaming, he's chasing her. The lot attendant is close behind him, and then I notice. The driver chasing her has a knife. Woman passenger runs towards the courthouse, up the steps, and the driver chasing her catches up. Courthouse police are running toward them now, 3 of them, guns drawn yelling at them to stop. The driver tackles the woman. Remember, he has a knife, and as they tussle on the ground, we hear 4 to 5 gunshots. I could have sworn they just killed both of them, but the woman jumps up and is quickly ushered into the courthouse by one of the cops. The other 2 approach the man, guns still drawn, and he rides around a bit then goes still. My wife didn't think they were real gunshots. She thought they were beanbags or something. Thankfully, my daughter was in a rear-facing car seat and had no idea what was going on. We turned around and left. News later reported the woman was being physically abused by the man, but she convinced him to take her to the courthouse to deal with a speeding ticket or something. She took her chance to get away. He chased her with the knife, and the courthouse cops shot and killed him. I was crazy impressed that they fired into this tangle of 2 people and the woman wasn't injured. Still doesn't feel totally real that I watched those cops shoot and kill that guy.